All of a sudden, if you've been here with us in Romans, when we were in Romans 9 to 11, and I spoke specifically on the nation of Israel and God's place of Israel in the historical redemption of history, all of a sudden those sermons became very relevant as of recent. And we stand with Israel as God's chosen people to pray for them, to pray for those families that are grieving even today, just being mercilessly slaughtered for no reason other than just existing and being a Jew. We must keep ourselves in the know about understanding that just as in Esther that Haman wanted to destroy all Jews, that thought and that thinking and that anti-Semitism is still alive today. And there will be those who try to tell you that it's not or it's their fault, but that is how things like the Holocaust happened. When people continue to deny the reality that there are some people who just, their goal is that a certain group of people, namely the Jews or other ethnic groups, but in this case, they don't deserve to live. And we stand with Israel to pray for them, to support them. And as I was thinking about that, as we make our way into Romans 12 here and verses 17 to 21, that war itself, is it not the reflection at some point when a nation steps in to defend itself? Isn't that often, almost always related to someone has decided that I am going to harm or hurt you in some way, for some selfish way, and ultimately wars themselves come about because people choose to be enemies for various reasons. And Paul's going to touch on how we particularly should view our enemies. And so if you have your Bibles open to Romans 12, and I appreciate Mike reading that for us as we can jump right into it. And what we've been learning together in Romans in this little mini-series in the series of Love in Action is that as a believer, Christ's calling on our lives is a call to love truly and genuinely. Now remember, Romans 12, verse 9, what does it say? You look, you see it, underline it if you haven't. Romans 12, verse 9 says, let love be what? What does it say? Let love be what? Genuine. Let love be genuine. Genuine and Christ-like, selfless and self-forgetful. As a believer, Christ's calling on our lives is to display that love as an act of worship. That how I love the people in my life is particularly and most importantly about what? Worship. It's an act of worship. How I love the people in my life, from those closest to me to those farther out from me to even my enemies, is an act and should be an act of worship to God, first and foremost. Not a behavior you check off, but a relationship you have with Jesus that informs your horizontal relationship with others. Christ's calling in our lives is to express his love in truth and in action. It can't just be words, it's got to be action. And if you haven't learned this yet, the last couple weeks, looking through Romans 12, and just in your own Christian walk, that this call to love like Christ is so radical that it's impossible. It's so radical that it's counterintuitive to every knee-jerk or sinful natural inclination that is in us. It's so radical, it's impossible to do without the aid of God's Spirit. You can't do it. You cannot love the people in your life correctly unless you are relying on God's Spirit to help you do what is actually impossible for you to do. If you miss that, you're going to try to do it in your own strength. If you miss that, you could end up thinking you've arrived because look at what I've done. Look at, in my strength, how I've loved others. That's another problem, right? And honestly, as I thought, even in my own life, I can quote and I can memorize scripture like 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not irritable or resentful. It doesn't insist on its own way. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. We can talk about love. We can memorize passages on love, but to truly live it out, I'm telling you, it's impossible without God's Spirit. It's impossible for us, but only possible as we rely and depend on God's Spirit to help us. And Paul wants us to know that, because he spent 11 chapters telling us all the things we couldn't do on our own. And all that we are in this moment as a believer is only because of the grace of God. We didn't arrive. We didn't figure it out. We didn't the Lord didn't kind of spin us up and then we got enough energy and inertia that we were able to carry ourselves the rest of the way. No, we need him from beginning to end, all the way through. And as we looked at, and I'll throw it up there again for you, the three major categories of love we saw here in Romans 12. Three major categories. This first is to love God with all of your heart. So that's got to be the center. Let love be genuine. If love is not an act of worship to you, first and foremost to Christ, you're going to miss how you should treat others. You will only be able to love them in the well of your own selfishness. So you will love them for how they will love you in return. So we must love God, and love be genuine. Then from there, Paul seems to expand out a little bit in category 2 in love for our church family, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago. I can't say I love God and I'm part of his family and be so disconnected from God's family. It just, I only show up for dinner. If my son only showed up for dinner, if one of my boys only showed up, the only time I ever saw him is when that dinner bell in his stomach rang, and that's it. We really wouldn't have much of a relationship. But it's in living life together. It's in solving problems together. It's in being there for each other, praying for each other, invested in each other's lives. That's the way the church family should be. Don't love God if I don't love my church family. Category 3, Paul moves out in verses 14 to 16 in Romans 12. Love for our unsaved community. If I only love those who love me or only love my family, that's well and good. But even unbelievers do that, Jesus said. Our love's got to extend to our community. And this fourth category we'll talk about this morning is almost like, we're going there, Paul? Like the other ones were like, yep, I get it. Love church family, love your community. But even there in the first century, even among the religious leaders, they themselves often devised ways in which you don't need to love your enemy. But Paul says, no, and even category number 4, verses 17 to 25, we must love those who are hostile towards us. We must love those who are our enemies. And I would submit to you that perhaps the greatest display that a Christian can give, that Christ lives in them and his love is inside of them, is most clearly seen in how you treat those who are completely against you, that want nothing to do with you. Frankly, they want to harm you. They hate you. And how you treat them as a Christian is one of the marks that, wow, that person is a Christian. That person understands what Christ really did for them, and they're willing to extend that to others. But again, that's radical. That's counterintuitive to the way we think. And we'll talk about that. Luke 6, which no doubt Paul probably had on his mind, whether orally or he had it written down at this point, but Luke 6:27, Jesus said, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you." Paul isn't going rogue here. He's further explaining what Jesus had already taught, to love your enemies. Now, this is a command, not a suggestion. And I have learned this as a parent. I'm still learning all the time because I mess up a lot. But there are times as a parent that I'm being nice and I should have just given a direct command. I'll give you an example. I was trying to tire the puppy out. Amy's not here. So I got puppy, I got a 4-year-old, I got an 11-year-old, and we're all trying to get to the here. So got to tire the puppy out, right? And so I told Aaron, I said, "Aaron, go grab one of Macy's toys so you can play with her." And he goes, "No, not right now. Maybe later." And it was funny because he took what I said and how I said it as it came to him. It was a suggestion. It was like, well, if you want to, go get a toy. When I should have said, "Aaron, go get the toy for Macy so you can play with her." Should have just kind of given him a direct command. Well, Paul here and Jesus also are giving us a direct command. to love our enemies. It's a command. It is not a suggestion. It's not like, well, not right now, I'll love my enemies. Maybe later. It's a command that is attainable, not unattainable. So we might think that's impossible. It is impossible, but nothing with God is impossible. This command is about wrongfully taking justice into our own hands personally. So this passage is not a call to pacifism. You know what pacifism is that there's not a time in which you can defend yourself. There's not a time in which a nation cannot defend themselves. We just lay down our arms and we just take it. That's not what this passage is talking about. We know that because in Romans 13, he's going to talk about how the government has been ordained by God to protect its citizens and defend. Here, though, Paul is addressing a personal, interpersonal desire to wrongfully take justice into your own hands, particularly on your enemies. And so, as we walk through this text, we need to keep that in mind, is that Paul is talking about interpersonal relationships. That how I view people in my life, even those who are my enemies, should be viewed through the lens of how Jesus has loved me. And so if you're taking notes and following with us, we're going to unpack and explore this main idea. Christ's love must radically transform how you love your enemies. It's got to radically transform it. Just as we were radically transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, so our love should be radically transformed by how we treat our enemies. Now, why should this be? Well, right off the bat, if you're a believer here this morning and you know Christ as your Savior, you were once an enemy. Do you understand that? Like you might have been raised in the church like me, okay? You heard all the stories like I did. You could regurgitate any of the things that are what you need to say if someone asks you about some question about Jesus. Or sometimes in Sunday school, kids just raise their hand no matter what the question is and they just say, Jesus. You could be like me and you grew up in the church. And you know all these things. But you got saved, sure, and you got saved like me in the church, or you knew these things. But before you came to Christ, you were just as much an enemy as anybody else of the gospel. Even if you were little. Your little heart was an enemy of the truth that would set you free until Christ came and set you free. So we got to remember that. Because if we forget that, there's no way you're going to be able to obey these verses. If you don't reflect on God's love and how that will change how you view other people, here's the other thing. You might not have God's love in you. Because the common mark and characteristic of a believer is always, if God's love is in me, then I must be willing to share that love with others, how He has loved me. You know, maybe as we walk through this morning, you'll discover that you need a saving relationship with Jesus as you examine how you treat those who have wronged you. I mean, we sing about it, we talk about it, and I just want to pause for a moment to just simply say that if you're here and you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, you are missing anything else that I would say this morning you could not do. It is impossible until you have not religion. You don't need religion. Religion saves nobody. Just going through the motions of religion. You need a relationship with Jesus, who alone can save you. So Christ's love must radically transform how you and I love our enemies. And this begs the question, doesn't it? Like, who are our enemies? I think we get tripped up on that sometimes. You know, who are we talking about? Who are our enemies? Because I think there are times I sometimes treat people in my life as enemies who are actually just people who aren't doing what I would like them to do. That's not people that are my enemies. That is just me being selfish and creating my own laws by which I hold those in my kingdom to my laws. That's not really what this is talking about. That's a different problem. An enemy, particularly here in the first century, is a person who is deliberately inflicted and continues to, or has developed a pattern of inflicting harm upon us. Could be someone far away. Happened once and they're gone. Could be someone close to us in relationship who has developed a pattern of harming us. Could be verbal abuse, where it's just words that tear down, words that manipulate, words that control, words that cage you in so that you aren't treated like an image bearer of God. You are treated as someone who is to be a servant of that particular person. Could be someone far away, someone close. Here, in this text in Romans 12, I think Paul is talking about specifically related to those who are enemies of the gospel. The persecution that may come about in the first century just from simply naming the name of Christ and claiming to be a follower of Christ. But I think applicationally, it can be anyone who has developed a pattern who has hurt us, harmed us, and doesn't really seem to care. Like their goal is they just want to tear you down. So as we walk through this text, I want to give you 3 steps to help us love our enemies like Christ, our perfect example. I think 3 steps can be kind of drawn out of here in verses 17 to 21. Step number 1 is to reshape your attitude. So if we're going to be radically transformed in how we treat our enemies, we have to start with the inner. We have to reshape our attitude and our heart towards our enemies, towards those that would seek our harm. Look at verse 17, Romans chapter 12. Paul says, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all." So step 1, reshape your attitude. Our natural and sinful reaction to someone who hurts or harms us is repayment and restitution. If you do that to me, I have the right to do that to you, up to the extent that you have done that to me. It's really built into how we think as sinful creatures. It's not an excuse. I'm just simply saying that's how we choose to think. They come out in statements. I'm going to pay them back. Comes out in advice. Well, they got what they had coming to them, didn't they? It comes out in excuses. Well, they did it to me, so I did it to them. It comes out in behavior that is fired up by unholy and unrighteous anger and bitterness. And so Paul says, as he asks us to reshape our attitude, he says in verse 17 that we've got to turn away from a mindset of ungodly restitution. And often, when you think of anger, anger itself always tends to have, sinful anger has built into it that I am very big and I have very big rights. And you have violated those rights, and therefore I have the right to seek justice that you have wronged me. And it's not about, sinful anger isn't about seeking God's kingdom. Seeking justice in a sense of the afflicted are being oppressed. Someone is being hurt, and God is not for this. Generally, anger for us is almost always sinful. And it's always related to my will be done, my kingdom come. Not the other way. God's will be done, God's kingdom come. So Paul says in 17, don't repay anyone evil for evil. It's not what Christians do. And retaliation, that's really what's going on here in verse 17, is a mindset of retaliation. That I will go on the counteroffensive. It's a counterattack. That if you wrong me or you do something to me, then I am in the right to counteroffense and counterattack you. And frankly, it can even happen right in your heart that nobody even knows it's going on, but you're doing it in your head, you're doing it in your heart, you're thinking about how you want to pay that person back for what they've done. There's so many ways this text can be applied. I agree with one of the pastors that I was looking through this week and studying that sometimes it's best to spread the truth and say, okay, here's what you have to apply, and I'm going to trust that God is going to help you know exactly where you need to apply this truth to your life, because there's so many ways we can apply this truth in many different situations. This mindset of ungodly restitution is not Christian. Going on the attack is not Christian. It's being fired up and motivated by letting a person have it. Just last month, on September 17th of this year, at an NFL football game, a Miami Dolphins player, and I saw some of the video, there was a Miami Dolphins player who was at, I believe, the Patriots game and stadium, and something transpired where these two fans got in a fight with each other, to which it escalated to the point that the Patriots fan, that one of them, the Miami Dolphins fan, punched another Patriots fan in the face twice and killed him. He was taken on a stretcher and he was declared dead at the hospital over a football. You think of that, what wicked passion over something so stupid like a ball. You think of what idolatry and false worship, that seeing a person wearing a different jersey somehow means that we can escalate a situation to the point where violence would ensue that takes a fellow image bearer. How did that start? Where does that come from? It escalated quickly. You're my enemy. So Paul says, we Christians, we cannot do that. We must turn away from this mindset of restitution, and we must turn toward an attitude of godly, what I'm going to call godly diplomacy. So you have your eyes in verse 17 here. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all, and if possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So we turn from an attitude of restitution, and we turn toward an attitude of godly diplomacy. What is diplomacy? If you define that, well, diplomacy generally is a political term, and we use it as a way to describe a principle substitute for the use of force. So diplomacy is the substitute. Instead of force and violence, we're going to exercise diplomacy to hopefully seek peace. So diplomacy is the skill of seeking peaceful solutions to potential hostile situations. That's the kind of mindset and attitude we must, with God's Spirit, reshape from an attitude of restitution to an attitude of diplomacy. And Paul, it's interesting here because what Paul is saying to us is there are going to be times that there's nothing you can do as a Christian. Like you could try everything to seek peace and the other side won't have anything to do with it. Where do I see that? Well, in verse 17 into 18, in verse 18 he says, if possible. So he says, give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Which means there are times and circumstances that no matter how lovingly you treat an enemy, they will remain your enemy. Paul knows this, he's being real. But he still calls us to an attitude of diplomacy. Really with this question, if possible, give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, what can I do in this situation to live honorably with this person? What can I do that will bring honor to the name of Christ? Because remember, if you call yourself a Christian and you're wearing the jersey Christian, everything you do, everything you say, everywhere you go either represents Christ or it misrepresents Christ. That when you go and when you say what you say to who you say it, you ultimately are declaring this is how Jesus would respond, or this is really not how Jesus would respond. So to give thought when Paul says give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all, he's saying slow down, don't react. Whenever we react, it's not good. Even when it comes to anything we purchase. If you impulse buy, generally speaking, we could all give testimony of that was not smart. I shouldn't have just knee-jerk reacted. Well, how much even more true when it comes to those we're having challenges with? Don't give thought. Slow down. Give attention beforehand. Carefully think about, how can I bring honor to Christ? How can I bring myself down and go, John, this isn't about you. Don't make this about yourself. Don't make this about yourself. What will bring honor to the name of Christ? To show the world that we are real Christians. And then question number 2, live honorably in the sight of all. Well, question 2 then would be right out of the text is, what can I do in this situation to live peaceably? Oh, I don't need to insist on that. I don't need to say that. I don't need to say it in this way. I didn't need to write that text. I shouldn't have made that comment on Facebook. That was pointless. There's so many ways that this can be applied. What can you do in the situation you're in to live peaceably, even with those who don't believe the gospel, don't accept Christ, and often are our enemies? What are the things I can change and should change in my own heart towards this person? Have you ever found how true the scriptures are in Proverbs 15:1 that says that a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger? I've found that so true that I keep working on that in my own life, even as I work with my children, that when I take what my 4-year-old says and he says it in a certain way, and then I kind of just jump in with my authority, but if I were to kind of bring my voice down, and I have to realize, I have a really loud voice. So there are times I'm like, John, you got to remember you have a loud voice. So that comes across, right? So bring it down, and then I speak gently. It's amazing how different of a response can be brought out, even of your children, when you simply speak gently. And slow down. Stop making it about yourself, and that you wanted to get XYZ done, and you couldn't. And it's a redemptive opportunity. It's a redemptive opportunity. This is the same way we should view our enemies. Slow it down. Speak gentle. Don't be harsh. Show them Christ. See, if Christ and his love is living in you, then his attitude should be reflected. They'll put up 1 Peter 2 for you. 1 Peter 2 says, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. It's 1 Peter 2, 22 to 23. If we didn't have it up there. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When Jesus suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Now, I can read that real quick, but you got to stop and think about that. Do you know what that means? That when Jesus' beard was pulled out of his skin, when a crown of thorns was put on his head, and he was beat mercilessly on the top of his head, burying the thorns deeper into the most sensitive parts, and blood is running down his face. And as he has whipped with a leather whip that is attached with glass and rocks and things that were designed to stick on the skin, and then it would pull, and you would pull hard, and then chunks of skin would come off of your back. That as he carried, after all of that, attempted to carry his own cross, probably falling over multiple times before they grabbed Simon and said, you carry it. In all of that, he never sinned. He never returned threat for threat. There was no deceit in his mouth. He did not revile in return. He did not say, I don't deserve this. But he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. You are not allowed to seek your own justice, as we'll see in the second point. You must entrust yourself to God. And you must entrust himself to the justice that he himself has put in place here on earth, but ultimately, no matter what, even those systems are not perfect. There's only one who is. You see, if we truly love Christ, we have to follow his attitude, his mindset. We must reshape our attitude. That's the first step. What's the second? The second step is to redirect your desire. Verse 19, redirect your desire. Scripture is not all about just, okay, here's the behavior you need to do. There is talk of behavior and action that Christians should do, but in the Scriptures, it is always seen from the viewpoint of what you desire. What is your motive? James 4 says, why do fights and quarrels happen among you? Is it not this? Because of your desires. Your passions are at war within you, and you don't get what you want, so you fight, and you hit, and you verbally attack. It's our desires, what I deeply want that I'm not getting, that fuels how I view and how I treat others in my life. And because as an image bearer, we're unlike all other creatures. We have a conscience. We understand right and wrong. And because we understand right and wrong, we are creatures of justice. We want justice. When there is injustice like we have seen on our screens of what the Hamas terrorists have done, coming into just simply suburban areas, flying over, using ways in which they didn't know was possible to simply fly over the border with two men on these paragliders to fly in and just start mercilessly killing anyone they wanted. It was elderly, it was children, it was kidnapping them, it was lighting them on fire in their own car. We want justice. This was not a war. This was a massacre. This was not a war, this was terrorism. We should just call it what it is, don't we? And where is it coming from? Their desires. And that entire group has one goal, that Jews should not exist. It's wicked, it's wrong. And we want justice. When we are wrong, when we see wrong, we want justice. We are people of justice. It's not wrong in and of itself to want justice. Okay, so we have to caveat that because we could get this wrong. It's not sinful to desire justice in and of itself in a world that is full of injustice. I mean, I saw something that said, they have record and pictures of what these men had done to children and babies, slaughtering them. And someone posted, yeah, we have record too. It's called abortion. But nobody seems to care. You see, we want justice for that. But when we desire justice, we're at a crossroads. We're either going to get enraged, and if we could, take matters into our own hands, or wish we could take matters into our own hands, or we're going to entrust ourselves to the one judge who can handle the weight of that justice, the God of the universe. So we got to redirect our desire. Yes, we want justice, but ultimately we need to redirect that and say, God, you alone are the one who can handle that. So Paul says here in verse 19, beloved, he's speaking so tenderly. I love that. He knows this is hard truth. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. Generally speaking, our culture portrays personal vengeance in a fairly positive light. In the movies, where there's always a good guy and there's always a bad guy, there's a hero and there's the arch nemesis, right? That by the time the arch nemesis, he's kind of a flat character, he's kind of annoying, and he does bad things, and so by the time he gets eliminated, nobody cares that he's evaporated off the face of the earth, and that character is gone. Poof, see you later. And that hero got vengeance. The problem is in the real world, the bad guys are real people with a real soul. The real people with a real soul who are really lost and in need of Christ. They're not just like the people on our screen who just evaporate and go, that was a good story. Glad the bad guy got what he deserved. They're people who need Jesus. Don't you think Paul took this pretty personal when he wrote this? Imagine with me as Paul writes this and recalls being an enemy of Christ. He himself was an enemy of Christ. He sought to destroy Christians and throw them in jail and stood by as they were stoned to death. He had all of those recollections in his mind. And Christ found him as an enemy and saved him. And Ananias loved him enough to take him in when no one else would. This is very personal for Paul when he speaks about loving your enemies, because he had people love him when he really was an enemy of Christianity. And really, you and I are no different. Without Christ, without his Spirit, we are enemies of the gospel. And when you seek to avenge, you are declaring yourself. You think about this too. When he says never avenge yourselves, what is one of the reasons why we should never avenge ourselves? It's because, number one, if I am seeking to avenge myself, you know what I'm doing? I'm putting myself in the place of God. What I'm doing is saying, whether you realize it or not, you are saying, I am righteous and I know what is right in this situation, and I should give that person what they deserve. But you know, God could have killed you and I in our sleep last night for the sins we just did yesterday. And he would have been completely vindicated in doing so because he's holy and righteous, and he chose not to. Yet we think it's okay that we should execute or desire execution on our enemies. See how hypocritical that becomes really quick when we see ourselves in the light of a holy God. So we must redirect our sinful desire for personal vengeance by giving it to God. Paul's basically saying, leave it alone. I know you desire it. I know it's not necessarily a bad thing that you desire it, but you've got to leave it alone and give that to God. God's wrath is not the problem. We are the problem. We think we can handle what only God can handle. Paul already addressed, Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. God is loving and merciful and kind to every sinner. He's holding out so that you, if you're not a believer here this morning, that you would turn to him for forgiveness. But there is coming a day where all wrongs will be righted. You read Revelation 19 later this afternoon, where it speaks of Christ coming, riding a white horse, on it the name of King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and he executes justice swiftly. But for us, desiring personal vengeance on our enemy is a high crime against a holy God, because only he is righteous. Who of us could cast the first stone to anyone, anywhere, anytime, when we ourselves are in need of the same forgiveness, right? So if Paul says, leave it alone, leave it to the wrath of God, let God be God. Vengeance is mine. Verse 19, vengeance is mine. He's directly quoting Deuteronomy 32:35. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Let God be God. Believe that justice will be served. So leave it to God. Let God be God. And know that justice will be served. The reason we sometimes struggle with such anger towards those who do injustice, either to us or to others in the world, is because we are convinced that we are not seeing justice and we will never see justice. But I assure you, every wrong will be righted. Every child who has been harmed, every person who has been massacred in these things that have happened in Israel, there will be justice in this life, potentially, but for sure in the next. So we have to let God be God and know that justice will be served. And our attitude cannot be this either. So our attitude can't be, okay, I won't take vengeance, but boy, I won't give them what they deserve, but man, I can't wait till God gives you what you deserve. You can't do that either. That's the same thing in a different way. Same attitude like the sons of thunder, calling down fire from heaven. And the truth is, when we seek the destruction of our enemy in a hateful, hurtful, sinful way, it is we ourselves who begin to self-destruct. We know this, don't we, experientially? That when I harbor bitterness and anger and hatred towards somebody, ultimately that poison that I am drinking is hurting me. It's not hurting them. I keep drinking that poison, and I'm hoping it hurts you, but it's killing you and you alone. And again, we must follow the leader. Matthew 5:38-39. I think this one is on the slide here. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Follow the leader. Reshape your attitude. Redirect your desire. Verse 19. Step 3, reform your behavior. So we go from our attitude to redirecting our desire for justice to let's reform, let's change our behavior. And how do we do that? We got to put off these attitudes about our enemy and put these things on instead. So you look at verse 20, to the contrary, So now he's contrasting this negative, sinful tendency we have with what's the Holy Spirit-generated action and behavior we should have towards our enemies. It's to reform and change our behavior and treat them with love and kindness. Now, we're coming up on a really important date in October here. You know, I personally call it National Candy Day or National Support a Dentist Day. But I'm actually talking about a different day. October 31st is Reformation Day, which in history is one of the most important Christian dates. And in 1517, when Martin Luther said, you know what, things in the church need to change. We need to get back to teaching the truth of the Scripture. It was a call for reform, to change, a call to see the Bible as the only authority, not tradition and not dead religion. Well, I think when it comes to what Paul's saying here, when it comes to how we treat those who harm us, we need a personal reformation. We need to stand kind of like Martin Luther did and say, you know what, I'm done. I'm going to follow Jesus in this area and choose to love this person as Christ has loved me. Paul is going to tell you how you can have that reformation. And he's almost directly quoting Proverbs 25, 21 to 22, where there it's stated, if your enemy's hungry, give him something to eat. Give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head. He is quoting directly Proverbs 25. So in verse 20, Paul now takes us to the right behavior. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, and by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. So the God-glorifying behavior is to nourish and care for your enemy. That if you saw your enemy on the side of the road laying there, think of the story of the Good Samaritan. The only person who stopped and helped was the very one who was thought to be the enemy. And he cared enough for the soul of that person to say, I'm not just going to walk by. I've got to do something. So the God-glorifying behavior is to nourish and care and be kind to your enemy. Now we know that's not always possible. Okay, so we have to understand that. We know the Proverbs are general principles. They're not promises, as if in every situation, in every case, that's possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Your enemy won't allow you to have anything to do with them. We understand that. But if it's possible, care for your enemy. If they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. It's the God-glorifying behavior with a God-glorifying result. That's there at the tail end of verse 20. So what's the purpose of this? Why be kind? You know, I would say in our world, people say, the worldly thinking is be kind to your enemy, be kind to those, forgive them so that you feel better. You'll feel better that you're not doing what they're doing, which ultimately turns it all around back on myself. You will feel better about you. That's not what's going on here. Why do I care for enemy? Why do I love them? Because I have a deeper thought in my mind is that I want that person to know Jesus. I want them to see past me and see the God who saved me. What's the God-glorifying result? In doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, that's an interesting metaphor. Some are wondering, did this proverb, because it was given in Proverbs, some thought, okay, this might have come from Egypt, and some would go out and kind of wander around as a sign of contrition, that they would have a burning coal pot on their head and they would walk around in Egypt. That's possible. That's where maybe that came from. We don't ultimately know for sure, but we do know from the context that what Paul is meaning here is that the result of being kind to your enemy is that God may use your response, your kindness, your love that is out of this world, if you're following me, to bring conviction in their life and see their need for salvation. Why be kind to your enemy? Why love your enemies? Why feed them? If they show up at your door, you see them living in a tent somewhere and they got nothing, why give them some money to get some food? So that they would see past you and maybe desire the God that has saved you who can save them. It's in the hope that they would go, you know what I'm doing is wrong. Look at how this person is responding. They're responding in kindness. I shouldn't have done what I did. What is different about them? They have Jesus. How did they do that? It can change everything. But when we repay evil for evil, that is an escalating wickedness that ultimately, who knows where that will take us. You know, when David had a chance to kill Saul, a couple times, he didn't do it. And then Saul found out that he had a chance to kill him. Do you remember what Saul's response was? It was conviction. It was, why do I keep pursuing you? I'm so sorry. What was I thinking? You're better. Clearly, God is going to put you in as king. Do you see? The result was the heaping burning coals on his head was he felt bad for his sinful, wicked behavior. And he could have changed, but unfortunately Saul's was much worldly sorrow. How about Christ's sacrificial love? The very crowd that chanted, "Crucify him," the very crowd that the day before was chanting, "Crucify him, we want nothing to do with him." In a not too distant future, Peter is preaching a message to that same crowd saying, in love, but saying, you guys did this. And Christ didn't revile. He put himself on the cross so that you could be forgiven. And you remember what the response is in Acts? They were cut to the heart. And they said, what do we do? You're right. They were remembering how Jesus just laid on the cross. He literally just laid on the cross. No one lays on a cross. And we were chanting, "Kill him." And he just laid there. And then we heard him say, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." They saw his love in response to their evil, and they were cut to the heart. And they sought salvation. And that's when Peter said, repent and believe in the gospel and be saved. The Jerusalem church was built of many of the people who themselves were enemies that day, who crucified Christ. They became the church. See, the result is to do kindness so that they would see Jesus. That's the God-glorifying result. And then in verse 21, we see the God-glorifying principle. So you see the God-glorifying behavior, the God-glorifying result. What's the God-glorifying principle? What do we walk away with? What's Paul he's coming to a crescendo. If you like music, crescendo, where you're emphasizing, and I might build to a point. Like when we sing Just As I Am, we start out slow, we're thinking meditatively, and we build to the chorus, and we sing with all our heart. Well, what is Paul building a crescendo to? Well, it's this principle, that evil is not overcome with evil. Evil is overcome only by good. He gives us another command in verse 21. Do not become overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's the principle to walk away with. That as we seek God's kingdom and as we seek to respond in a way that would honor Jesus, we slow down. We say, what can I do for this person? You know what? I'm going to do this. And I'm going to pray that God uses it to help them see that I don't think the way that they've said that I'm thinking. I'm not doing what they think I'm doing. That we Christians are not the way they're describing us. I mean, that's one of the reasons, isn't it, why we want to be so about doing kind acts for people in this community as a church, isn't it? Because many people, even in our culture and even in this community, they think because we believe what this Bible says, that we're hateful people. And we're enemies to them. But what we want to do by showing them and loving them is hopefully that they see but I don't know a lot of Christians, but those Christians on the hill, every time we go low, they go high. And it's because of Jesus. They won't say anything, they won't do anything to us in return, but they keep doing these things in the community to show us that they love us. That's what we should be doing individually. That's what we should be doing as a church. And the result was that people will be saved by how we do the most counterintuitive, radical thing, which is not repay, not seek vengeance, but seek the good of even our enemies, to pray for them, to care for them, to meet a need, to help them see Jesus wants to save you. See, Paul was taking it personal. He had people do this for him in his life. So we got to reshape our attitude, redirect our desire for justice, reform our behavior, because Christ's love must radically transform everything about how you treat and how you love your enemies.